Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup. Prashant, it's 15th of April, 2022. We're together without Zoe because Zoe is gallivanting in the northern tip of South America. I'm in the southern tip of South America. We seem to be spread all over the place. You're with Give the People What They Want, brought to you every week by People's Dispatch. Prashant and Zoe are the editors. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. Really happy to be with you again. I think, we had a smorgasbord of stories to share with you today. And it may be a curiosity that we've decided to start in France. But this was a big election, Prashad. What happened in the French primary of presidential election, or rather the first round? What happened?
The first round, yes. The next round is coming up in 10 days. Very close contest, actually, between three very clearly defined political poles. And I think that's one of the important results, one of the important aspects to note, that there's a lot of distinction between these three poles, although there was also a lot of similarity between the right, and I'll come to that. But of course, if you look at the straightforward results, Emmanuel Macron leading the first round with over 27, close to 28% of the votes. Marine Le Pen, the far-right candidate, gets 23.1%. Jean-Luc Mélenchon gets 22%, the left-wing candidate, and that's quite a creditable achievement. He won more votes than last time. Some interesting demographics if you look at the urban vote, if you look at the immigrant vote, if you look at the young vote. And overall, quite a creditable performance by him, because just a few weeks ago, he was polling much, much lower. So he was in the 10 to 12% range, sometimes close to 15. So to get to 22% was a substantial achievement. But unfortunately, as far as the French electoral system goes, only the top two candidates go to the next round, and that's Macron and Le Pen. And this really presents the voters of France with a very unfortunate choice. And this is, we had interviewed a French researcher some weeks ago who made the same point, that what this has meant is that now the rest of the election campaign will be fought on issues of the right. The issues of the left, that is that of social justice, of ecological justice, of redistribution of wealth, of welfare for senior citizens, of no pension reforms, which is a big demand of the French people. All these will get kind of sidelined as the issues of the right take predominance. It's important to note, however, that both Macron and Le Pen are now sort of trying to pivot and capture some of Mélenchon's voters by trying to speak that language. But I think Mélenchon's voters are very convinced that neither of these candidates actually sincerely represents that cause, because ultimately Le Pen has been the candidate of immigration, she's been the candidate of racism, she's been the candidate of dog whistles, and she benefited from the fact that a more far-right candidate, Eric Zemmour, was in the race, and she somehow appeared less extreme or right-wing. But that does not change any of the centrality, any of the viciousness of her positions. Whereas Emmanuel Macron, who came to power in 2017 saying that I'm the candidate of both the left and the right, and made all these tall claims, as government from a solidly right-wing platform, the archetype or the classic example of what you would call neoliberal policies. He's attacked the trade unions, he's attacked the freedom of the press, he's tried to increase the age of retirement, he's attacked the pension reforms, he's seen massive protests, the education system, the health system, all of the unions in all of these systems have time and again protested against him. And he's very clearly, even if you look at the demographics again, he's very clearly the candidate of the relatively more well-off, not the relatively poorer. And this is really, this tag is really sort of stuck to him. So, like I said, unfortunately, the voters presented with a very difficult choice. One sign of hope, of course, like I said, from the improvement of the left is that there are parliamentary elections coming up in June. This time, the left was unfortunately quite divided. If the left is able to sort of come together on a more cohesive platform to see the potential of this early round of elections, they may be able to achieve substantially more in the parliamentary elections that are coming up in June. But this is a big question. Will they be able to do that? But right now, in the next few days that are coming up, it remains to be seen, what this large component or contingent of left voters will decide. Many might decide to abstain. Many might decide to vote for Macron, saying that, because they don't want Le Pen to come in. Some might even switch to Le Pen because of some of her positions on Europe, for instance, and positions which are against the norm of neoliberal globalization, so to speak. So a very a very confused and very complicated picture in France, and it I think adequately represents the failure of the European Union model, of the politics of Europe, which they try to thrust upon the entire world, the politics of austerity, the politics of the politics of the rich, the politics of the 1%, so to speak, where large numbers of people just completely fell off the economic life of the country. They were reduced to extremely difficult conditions. And this shows the bankruptcy of that politics once again. The traditional parties which practiced this the most, the Socialist Party and the Republican Party, were decimated. And they were just completely got less than 5%. So a mixed picture. Like I said, for the coming election, not a great situation for the French. But can the left pick up from here? Very important question to watch out for.
I mean, you've done a thorough job of this report. Of course, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who ran on the left, as you had, got very close to being in the second round. If the Communist Party candidate had put his votes in with Mélenchon, they would have gone ahead of Macron, and dare I say, might have come out as the leading candidate of all, which says a lot about France and says a lot about the nature of election campaigns and the way in which people can get things quite wrong in a way. Well, speaking of election campaigns and democracy and human rights and all these wonderful things, it's the 20th year anniversary of the attempted, now bear in mind the language, the attempted coup d'etat against the government of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Interestingly, Mr. Chavez won not one election. He won the election to become president in 1999. But Mr. Chavez then accelerated democracy, and I don't know how many elections Venezuela has had since then, but between 1999 and 2002, they had elections towards a new constitution. They had elections to make sure, referenda of all kinds and so on. There was no dearth of democratic activity taking place inside Venezuela between 1999 and 2002. No lack of it. I do remember, Prashant, in the Canadian and US press, there was just fulmination, often led directly without shame by the mining industry, going after Mr. Chavez, because President Hugo Chavez of Venezuela had already begun to roll back the power of the North American mining companies over Venezuela's various resources, but also over its government. I think that's important. He was trying to push them out of, quote unquote, advising the government. Very easy to advise the government with suitcases of cash, I must say. That is the principal form of advice offered by big corporations. In fact, Mr. Monk, who was the head of Barrick Gold, writing in a Toronto newspaper, began to say, well, Mr. Chavez is now wait for it again, is a what? Is a Democrat? Because after all, Mr. Chavez had won an election, Mr. Chavez won referenda and so on. What was Mr. Monk going to say? Well, certainly not that Hugo Chavez was a democratic leader. He called him autocratic. On the basis of what? Particularly given the fact that Mr. Peter Monk, after whom a School of International Studies is named at the University of Toronto. Wonder what they teach there, Prashant. But Mr. Monk, who himself hadn't really won an election to be the head of one of the world's largest mining companies, but autocratically ran it, created, in a way, the atmosphere for the coup attempt against Hugo Chavez. Well, the people rose up to defend the government of Hugo Chavez. They defeated the coup, as they have, it seems, thus far defeated a number of attempts to overthrow governments in Venezuela. It's very interesting. There's a lot of talk. Every time there's an election in Venezuela, there's a lot of talk about electoral fraud. The Europeans come out, they talk about fraud, the United States, the Canadians, and so on. Interesting that they don't reflect on their own role in the opposite of election fraud, which is a coup d'etat, the very antithesis of democracy. It's 20 years since the Venezuelan people, push back against that coup. Well, you're now talking about the French elections. How much democracy do the French people experience, given that, a quarter of the vote, the left vote, will no longer have an easy place to go in this election. It's extraordinary. There's a lot to reflect on, not just on current events, but on the philosophy of democracy and the philosophy of elections and so on. A lot to look at. A lot to look at, particularly given the fact that in many countries in the world, the pandemic continues. It's not over. The all clear seems to have been sounded, but the WHO, the World Health Organization, hasn't been all clear yet. Well, in Greece, South Africa, other places, serious debates going on about healthcare. Prashant, take us in there.
Right. Actually, this refers to two sets of actions that took place in March, but I think are important to note because they have a really global significance. Greece and South Africa, countries quite far apart, not very often, not brought together under the same banner, referred to simultaneously in any context. But in each country, we see a series of processes which are very dangerous, considering that we were in the third year of the pandemic and we were supposed to learn lessons about how to manage our health better. So if you look at Greece, for instance, there's the proposal by the government to bring a new national health service, which has some absurd, proposals. For instance, starting with the idea that, private practicing doctors will be subcontracted by the public health system instead of the government hiring fresh professionals, or that, say, private practitioners can actually perform surgeries in public health clinics at various points of time, which means that public health facilities essentially become private facilities for so many hours a day. And at this point of time, even insured patients will have to contribute 30% of the cost of the surgery as well as the fee of the surgeon right now in public health facilities. So, Greece is faced with a shortage of healthcare professionals. There's no doubt about it, as were countries across the world. And it was very clear when the pandemic struck that this was the case. But the question many people asked was that, will we learn a lesson from this experience, from the experience of the pandemic, when health professionals actually sacrifice so much? But the answer is clearly no, because these are the kind of proposals that are being brought up. And for that matter, the fact that, if you want to sort of go to a public hospital, you need to go via your family practitioner. That's a new rule that is being brought in. Whereas no such rule exists when you want to go to a private hospital, which means that you're automatically creating barriers in order to be able to access public health care. And if you look, for instance, at the fact that these family practitioners themselves are going to get stipends as well to register patients, which means they're probably going to register younger patients as well. So very important article by from Zoe Parishadi from the People's Health Movement, who's been covering this issue and really talks about, some of the strategies that governments across the world are employing. Now, if we switch over to South Africa, we see exactly another process that is also taking place on the same lines, which is that a lot of workers who were contracted to assist in healthcare work, to do essential healthcare work during the pandemic, their contracts are expiring right now. And the government's solution has been to basically say that, we cannot allot funds for these, et cetera, and many of these workers are either in danger of losing their jobs. Some of them have already lost it. Some other workers are clearly protesting very strongly against it. And I think at least in one place they were able to sort of manage to save their jobs. But as our friends in the People's Health Movement have pointed out, that this also brings in the question of the IMF as well, because IMF did provide financial assistance to South Africa for the pandemic response. But interestingly, if you look at the clauses in the IMF package that basically South Africa got, it already called for austerity towards what was the end of the pandemic. So there was a very clear stipulation, not only for South Africa, but countries across the world, that by 2021, 2022, you should once again start cutting down on costs, once again reduce hiring. So this is actually the underbelly which many people did not notice. We know that the IMF and the World Bank made a lot of noises at that point of time about helping poor countries, etc., etc. But these were the conditionalities that continued to be, associated with these loans. So when we talked about France and the kind of development model that Europe has been following and what the IMF and the World Bank have imposed across the world, this is really how you see it in practice. People losing their jobs, people not being able to access public health care, people, struggling to find the money to even go to some of these institutions which are either being shut down. So very unfortunate to see that after all these years, after one of the greatest health cataclysms of our time, we are still back to ground zero in terms of how healthcare is being administered, how much money is being spent in terms of healthcare.
You're to give the people what they want, coming to you every week, and we mean it, every week, from People's Dispatch. That's peoplesdispatch.org, one of the best places to get movement driven. You might wonder what's movement driven. Movement driven news anywhere on the internet. Prashant and Zoe are the editors. Today, Zoe, as we said, is not with us, but Prashant and I are here. I'm Vijay from Globetrotter. Globetrotter is a global syndication service, gets you news and reports into publications all over the world. Give us all a bit of your energy. We need it. It's Friday. We're bringing you world news. Unfortunately, not always the most exciting news. Although, here, pivot. I have something interesting to tell you about. Now, I don't normally read the Lancet, but during the pandemic, I've taken to looking at the Lancet periodically because it's one of the most important journals for civilians of developments in public health and so on. I say for civilians because, as you know, it's very difficult to read, even for those of us who journal. It's very difficult to read scientific journals. Can't follow what's happening. I'm very grateful to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for producing executive summaries that are quite digestible. Although I am told that in the last IPCC report, where they had the red light on climate change, apparently the scientific section was much bleaker than the executive section that many of us read and many of us were able to then report from. Well, yes, the IPCC has said there's a red alert and matters are terrible. Fast forward to Rio 1992, where during the great summit on the environment, the countries of the world agreed to a formula called combined and differentiated responsibilities, where they said, look, we have all common problem. We have a common problem: environmental disasters, climate change. At the time, even the ozone layer and so on. We have common problems, therefore the word common, but also differentiated responsibilities. There are differentiated responsibilities. Different people have contributed to this disaster in different ways. If you just look at environmental degradation, it's quite clear. Capitalist firms play the largest role here. Imperialism played a large role. I remember traveling in the northern forests of India, large clear cutting of forests. Now, similar clear cutting was done in northern New York State, where entire old growth forest was brought down. But then a conservation movement grew in America and new trees were planted and so on. Nothing like that was done in, say, the hills of the Shivalik mountains, the foothills of the Himalayas, where for generations, hills looked scarred. Differentiated responsibilities. Well, as I said, I read the Lancet once in a while, and in Lancet Planetary Health this month, there's an excellent article by Professor Jason Hickel and his colleagues called National Responsibility for Ecological Breakdown. Now, the bottom line, friends, is that, and I'm quoting from them, high-income nations are responsible for 74% of global excess material use, driven primarily by the United States at 27% and the EU at 25%. That's 28 high-income countries. China is responsible for 15% of global excess material use, and the rest of the global South, that is all the countries of Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, Middle East, and the rest of Asia, responsible for only 8%. This is extraordinary. I mean, this is an extraordinary set of data that they have presented here. I don't know what to make of it, frankly. I was shocked to read this. And the reason I'm putting this on the table is related to the debates that took place at COP26 about who bears the greatest responsibility. But now remember, this article is not about historic responsibility alone. They look at resource use. Now, mark this, this is important. They look at resource use from 1970 to 2017. 1970. This is not during the colonial era. This is not during the high era of imperialism. This is from 1970, the neoliberal era. From 1970 to 2017, high income nations are responsible for 74% of excess resource use. That is extraordinary. Have a look at it. We'll all be writing more about this study. We'll be looking carefully at its implications and so on. But as far as as I said, a civilian in many of these matters, as far as I'm concerned, I was shocked to look at these numbers. Now, we're going to pivot. We're going to go to occupied Jerusalem, a major city in the Middle East, where it is a flashpoint regularly of something or the other related to the apartheid Israel state. Prashant, what happened at Al-Aqsa, the mosque at the center point of occupied Jerusalem?
Right, Vijay, it's Ramadan season, and as usual, the Israelis have continued. I mean, there's an air of, I don't know. It's very difficult sometimes to talk about this, because just last year you were talking exactly about it's the very same thing, which is that at Al-Aqsa Mosque, a key site for Israeli Zionist attacks. There is at least one section of the Zionist movement which even wants to destroy that mosque. And settlers constantly barging in, Israeli forces constantly barging in. Today morning's incident, very shocking again, because about 150 Palestinians injured in the Israeli security forces attack on the mosque. The Israelis, of course, had some excuses. Some firecrackers were burst, etc., etc. But what this is collective punishment. There's no doubt about it, because this is a season where people gather in large numbers for prayers. It is obviously a very deliberate move. About, like I said, 150 people injured, or 400 arrested. And this is the kind of provocation, and needless provocation, but nonetheless a very deliberate one. And we have seen this happen time and again. Like I said, a combination of both Israeli settlers and Israeli security forces often working together in tandem, making it clear to the Palestinians, or trying to make it clear to the Palestinians that they do not belong there in whatever way. That is really the attempt of Israel, which has been the attempt all this while in multiple ways, whether it be the apartheid wall, whether it be the policy of settlements, whether it be attacks like in Hebron or in Al-Aqsa over here. And like I said, last year we saw this happen again and again and again. Multiple attacks happening almost every week for that matter. And then ultimately all of this culminated in the brutal Israeli assault on Gaza in May, in which again hundreds were killed. A very very horrible operation for which still there has been no justice, still there has been no accountability. So a very tense moment right now in occupied Jerusalem. Like you said, we need to watch and see what is going to happen in the coming days. Palestinian movements, of course, expressing their condemnation. There is likely to be protests. This also taking place at a time when there have been multiple incidents of clashes as well. Palestinians have been killed. Some Israelis also have been attacked and killed as well. So, during all these times, there's been, generally a very tense atmosphere. And this is a time when the right wing, in which case Israel is using to sort of build up tensions to create the possibility for another flashpoint, always convenient for Israel's right-wing politicians when something like this happens. Does Naftali Bennett need his own war? Very important question to ask. But ultimately, like I said, in some ways a very disappointing series of incidents, because it almost seems inevitable the way it happens, the way it is allowed to happen, the way Israel is given a free hand to keep doing this. And then we see the same voices rise in condemnation, or rise with this kind of mock indignation when there are incidents happening in other parts of the world. But whereas Israel has a full backing to continue doing this time and again for years. So that's where we are in Palestine.
Well, it's interesting. I saw the footage. It's appalling. Reminded me a little bit, Prashant, about the attacks taking place in India. The kind of hallucinatory, terrible, dangerous-looking protests in Madhya Pradesh, in Gujarat, and so on, led by very vicious elements of the Hindu right wing against places of Muslim worship, mosques, and so on. This is again the month of Ramzan. Yes, it was also the month of celebrations in India for Hindus. Some Hindus Today, by the way, is Happy New Year for Bengalis, so that's on the table for me. Happy New Year to you, Prashant. I forgot to start on that note. But the footage really did remind me of scenes from Madhya Pradesh, scenes from Gujarat. You want to say a few things about those terrible incidents, because I don't think we've really paid attention to them here.
Right, Vijay. Actually, that was exactly what was on my mind which is why I mentioned the global right as well. But again, a very, the two incidents almost exactly mirror each other, actually, because once again, we have, this kind of attempt to isolate the Muslims in India, to corner the Muslims in India. Ram Navami, of course, religious festival, but the kind of violent protests that have taken place in many of these areas in the northern part of India, the kind of violent sloganeering, the open brandishing of weapons that has taken place. All of this actually paint a very dangerous picture right now of Indian society. And the important thing to note is that despite all of this footage, like you said, once again, all of this footage being in public, despite the fact that the kind of slogans that have been shouted are not, it is no civilized society can actually accept that such slogans are being shouted, slogans of murder, slogans of sexual violence. There has been no condemnation from the people, the government at the very top, the prime minister, the home minister, who are seen by the large parts of the Hindu community, for instance, as their leaders. No condemnation from any of these figures, and this really is one of the most dangerous aspects of this, because we cannot dismiss this as the acts of just some violent people, or the acts of just some lumpen element, so to speak, which is often how everyone is prepared to say that, okay, it's just some people, this does not represent us, is what everyone is convenient. A lot of people are conveniently saying. But what we're seeing online, what we're seeing in the narrative on social media, on media, in conversations among people, is a normalization of hate, is the normalization of the understanding that, say, the minorities, the Muslims, they need to be taught a lesson. And this is actually a very, very dangerous situation for India to be in. Unfortunately, like I said, a clear abandonment of responsibility from those in power remains to be seen what happens, but very dangerous times as well.
Very dangerous. I mean, I think the point you made is a good one, which is that no civilized society should tolerate something like this. I mean, this is threats of intimidation. And let's be clear, friends, neither the Israeli government will condemn the attacks at Al-Aqsa Mosque, nor the Indian government has condemned these protests in Madhya Pradesh and in Gujarat and so on. No civilized society should bear this, because we're talking also about the feelings of people who feel beleaguered, and their sense of being beleaguered increases, and that creates its own kind of anger. It's the 50th day of Russia's war in Ukraine. It's got to be on the table for us. Again, very little advancement in terms of the ceasefire negotiations, the talks, and so on. A important Russian ship was scuttled and has sunk in the Black Sea. That's a very important development. Mr. Putin has warned the United States not to keep arming Ukraine. I doubt that's going to end. The arms manufacturers and arms traders are making a lot of money. Weapons bought by the countries like the United States and then delivered to Ukraine. This is going to continue for a long time yet. Danger, of course, is escalation. Will this go any further? Hard to say. 50 days of that war. We, of course, as journalists report it, but we also are people with feelings, and we hope that the war comes to a close at some point soon. That's one of the complexities, Prashant, in reporting terrible things like the incidents in Al-Aqsa, or the terrible violence in India of people standing there with their trishuls and their various weapons, chanting threats, including with quote unquote religious leaders right there with them, calling for rape and so on. It makes reporting a complicated business, because doctors have a Hippocratic oath, and I've talked about this before in this show. Doctors' Hippocratic oath means they have a right, they have an obligation to heal anybody and everybody. It doesn't matter whether you like the person or not. Journalists have a kind of similar thing. It's like what some lawyers have. Lawyers have a responsibility to defend their clients, even if they don't like them or don't like what they've done. Journalists have the responsibility to report stories. We have the responsibility to tell every side, in a way, setting the table for human understanding. At Give the People What They Want, brought to you by People's Dispatch and Globetrotter, that's what we strive to do. We're not just here to tell you what's happening. We hope, we strive to provide some kind of understanding. Well, see you next week.